Buyurun hocam, 10 saniye içerisinde başlayabilirsiniz.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our fourth week lecture on derivatives. Before I start my lecturing, again, I'm going to stop the video because I have some connection problem. This week, I'm going to cover swaps. Before we start our discussions on swaps, let me briefly go over with what we covered in the last week lecture when we discussed features. You remember last week we spent some time on the second building block of derivatives, so-called features. We define future contract as a contractual agreement made between two parties to buy or sell an asset through a regulated futures exchange at a certain time in the future for a certain price, so-called delivery price. When an exchange introduces a new contract, it has to specify in some detail the exact nature of the assets, what we call contract specifications, which includes the contract size, delivery points, delivery time, settlement type, whether it is going to be a physically delivered or cash settlement. This is one of the biggest difference between forwards and futures. Another important difference between futures and forward is that futures are traded on exchange while forwards are traded on the over-the-counter markets. One of the key roles of the exchange is to organize trading so that contract defaults are avoided via clearing, which is the process by which trades in futures and options are processed, guaranteed and settled by an entity known as the clearing house. Clearing houses perform many functions, including matching, guaranteeing, and settling all trades and registering positions from such trades. They also perform mark-to-market calculation of all open position at least once a day and oversee the resulting cash flow between clearing member of firms. Marking to market ensures that futures contract always have zero value. Hence, the clearing house does not face any risk. Marking to market takes place through margin payments. Market participants can use, of course, futures contract for hedging, speculation, or arbitrage purposes. However, futures contracts are not available for all assets. They might not have the same characteristic of the client's desire or needs. Therefore, swaps are important, filling these disadvantages of exchange-traded futures contract. This week, I am going to talk about swaps. First, I will define what we mean by a swap. Then I move to discussion of the mechanics of swaps by looking into how and what purposes swaps are used in commodity, interest, and currency markets. I will finish this week's lecture talking about advantages and disadvantages of swaps. Let's look at swaps first. Here, as I said, I'm going to talk about swaps. A swap is an agreement between two or more parties to exchange a sequence of cash flow in the future. The birth of the formal swap market can be dated back to currency swap negotiated between IBM and World Bank in 1981. Of course, we had swap agreements, swap transactions before 1981, but those were not formal trading or agreements. For example, two companies located in different countries would mutually swap loans in the currency of their respective countries. These arrangements allowed each company to have access to the foreign exchange of the other country and avoid paying any foreign currency taxes. However, we saw the birth of formal swap market in 1981. At that time, actually, the United States had an interest rate of 17%, West Germany rate was 11%, and Switzerland was 8%. The World Bank had reached its borrowing limits on German marks and Swiss francs because the World Bank faced significant demands from its borrowers in Swiss francs and German marks due to relatively lower interest rates. IBM, on the other hand, had large reserves of Swiss francs and German marks with debt payment owed in both currencies, but IBM was looking to increase the US dollar holdings when interest rates were high for corporate borrowers. The two parties, IBM and World Bank, realized they could reach a deal to leave both parties better off. They engineered a specially tailored contract in a transaction arranged by Solomon Brothers, which later became a part of Citibank. IBM swapped its borrowed Swiss francs and Deutsche Mark for the World Bank's US dollars. Thus, the first swap contract was born. The volume of the World Bank currency swap transaction grew quickly. In financial year 1982, the aggregate notional currency swap transaction was about $758 million. By 1983, it had increased to 1.73 billion. This structure of swapping cash flows ultimately served as the template for swaps on any number of financial assets and commodities. Of course, swaps serves as an effective hedging vehicle in much of the same way the financial futures contract. However, for example, a typical futures contract has many of the same characteristics as the swap, in that it is essentially a contract where the buyer of the contract agrees at the outset to pay a fixed price for a commodity in return for future delivery of that commodity, which will have an uncertain or floating value at the time of expiration of the contract. Let's delve into swaps a little bit. Forwards and future contracts settle on a single date. However, many transactions occurs repeatedly. For example, an airline company buys jet fuel oil on an ongoing basis. If a manager seeking to reduce risk confronts a risky payment stream, what is the easiest way to hedge that risk? You can enter into a separate forward contract for each payment you wish to hedge. However, it could be more convenient and entail lower transaction costs if there were a single transaction that we could use to hedge a stream of payments. Swaps serve exactly this purpose. You can call swaps kind of series of portfolio of forward contracts. As we said before, swaps are agreements between two companies to exchange cash flows in the future according to prearranged formula. Swaps are common, very common in interest rates, currencies, and commodities. They often extend much further into future than exchange contract. For example, regular swaps contract can 2 to 15 years or something. And basically, I said swaps are common in interest rates. When I last checked yesterday, Bank of International Settlement, the notional value of interest rates swaps are about $350 trillion. I'm talking about trillion. It is now basically 5 or 6 times the world's GDP. So swaps are generally intermediated by banks. And when the parties agree on a swaps agreement, they generally set the notional amount, the tenor or maturity of the swap, the payment dates, the floating price index, and the fixed price. One party makes a payment to the other party depending upon whether a price turns out to be greater or less than a reference price that is specified in the swap contract. For example, by entering into an oil swap, an oil buyer confronting a stream of uncertain oil payments can lock in a fixed price for oil over a period of time. The swap payments would be based on the fixed price and for oil and a market price that varies over time. So in this, swaps, as we said, serve as an effective hedging vehicle in much the same way as the financial future contract do. For example, a typical future contract has allows you, as many characteristics as a swap, in that essentially it's a contract where the buyer of the contract agrees at the outset to pay a fixed price for the commodity in return for future delivery of the commodity, which will have volatile prices. Swap agreements have also become popular vehicle for non-commercial participants such as hedge funds, pension funds, large speculators, commodity index traders, and others with large pools of cash to speculate on interest rates, forex, and commodity prices. So they can use swap agreement or contracts for speculation purposes. Let's start with commodity swaps. As I told you, swap agreements have become very popular vehicle for both commercial and non-commercial participants. Recently, for example, portfolio managers have sought to invest in commodities because of lack of correlation or negative correlation that commodities tend to have with traditional investments in stocks and bonds. In addition, because of the ability to tailor transactions, swaps can represent a more efficient means by which these participants can enter the market. Hence, many of the benefits that swap agreements offer commercial hedgers also attract non-commercial interest to the swap market. Since swap dealers are willing to enter into swap contract on either side of the market, they can be short or long. At times, they will enter into swaps that create offsetting exposure, reducing the swap dealer's overall market price risk associated with the firm's individual position opposite its counterparties. Since it's unlikely, however, that a swap dealer could completely offset the market price risk associated with its swap business at all times, dealers generally enter the futures market to offset the residual market price risk. As a result of the growth of swap market and the dealers who support the market, there has been an associated growth in the open interest of the futures market related to the commodities for which swaps are offered, as these swap dealers attempt to lay off the residual risk of their swap book. Of course, not only speculator, but also some other market participants can take some position, like commodity index traders or exchange traded funds can use swap agreement to take position in commodity swaps. Let's look at simple swap example. I just want to think about how this swaps contract can offer the flexibility. Consider the case of an airline wanting to hedge future jet fuel purchases. Currently, there is no jet fuel futures contract available to airlines to directly hedge their price exposure. Contracts for crude oil, from which jet fuel is made, of course, heating oil, which is a fuel having similar chemical characteristics to jet fuel, do exist. But while this contract can be used to hedge jet fuel through cross-hedging, the dissimilarities between the jet fuel and the crude oil or heating oil mean that the airline will inevitably take on what's referred to as basis risk. You remember basis risk, we define the spot difference between the spot price you want to hedge minus the future price you can hedge. That is in contrast, swap dealers can offer the airline the alternative of entering into a contract that directly references to the cash price for jet fuel at the specific time and the location where the product is needed. By creating a customized or tailored over-the-counter derivatives product that specifically address the price risk faced by the airline, and by taking on administrative cost associated with managing that contract over time, and by assuming the price risk attendant to that contract, the swap dealer facilitates the airline risk management. Suppose here, United Airlines is going to buy 100,000 barrels of jet fuel oil 1 year from today and 2 years from today. Of course, suppose that forward price for delivery in 1 year, $75 per barrel, and second year is $90 per barrel. And suppose 1 year and 2 years zero coupon bond yields are 5% and 5.5%. United Airlines, our airline company, can use forward contract to guarantee the cost of buying jet fuel oil for the next 2 years. The present value of this cost will be $152.29. Of course, United Airlines could invest this amount to buy jet fuel oil in 1 year and second year by going into a two different forward contract also. Or United Airlines could pay a jet fuel oil supplier $152.29, and jet fuel oil supplier would commit delivering 1 barrel in each of the next 2 years. This is prepaid swap. If the payment is done after 2 years, or if the payment is determined in advance and paid in arrears, then this is called postpaid swap. This shouldn't be. Payment should be done in arrears. It is 1 year after the delivery, second year after delivery. Of course, there is a risk over here. Oil might not be delivered or default in payments. More attractive solution for both parties is to defer payments until the oil is delivered. Typically, a swap will call equal payments in each year as long as any payment stream with the present value of 152. If you are going to make equal payments, this requires about $82.28 for this example in each year. This makes the present value of the cost is $152 29. But we then say this price as a 2-year swap price. However, any payments that have a present value of 152.29 are acceptable, as long as your net present value is 152.29. But as I said, generally, we do make equal payments. In this case, the swap price for 2-year contract, $82.28. Here we have a simple swap. There is a physical delivery. At the end of each year, oil buyer or jet fuel oil buyer pays to swap counterparty, pays about $82.28 per barrel for a delivery of 100,000 barrels of jet fuel. And then all you have to multiply this barrel times the number of barrels you want. That is your cost. And then in return, swap counterparty sends you 100,000 barrels of oil. But more generally, swaps are settled in cash. What if swaps settled in cash? Instead of delivery, if the swap counterparty is settled with cash, the oil buyer, here in this case, United Airlines, pays the swap counterparty the difference between swap price and the spot price. If the difference is negative, then the counterparty pays the buyer. And jet fuel oil buyer then buys the jet fuel oil in the spot market. For example, if the spot price is $90 at the end of 1 year, then the swap counterparty pays the buyer about $7.72, because in the spot market, the cost is higher. So if the oil buyer is going to buy from the spot market, he needs $7.72 per barrel. If the spot price on the other hand is $80, then oil buyer makes a payment to the swap counterparty. In this case, $2.28. Whatever the spot price at the end of 1 year or 2 years, the net cost to buyer is the swap price. That is the BT. You are fixing the payment. You are getting rid of all the uncertainties regarding the price for 1 year and 2 years. Here we have the basically you are not directly, you have the oil buyer and oil sellers, and then as an oil buyer or jet fuel buyer, you directly transact with oil seller, your oil business. But in terms of price fixing, you deal with the swap counterparty. Basically, for a swap on 100,000 barrels, we simply multiply, as I said, all cash flows by 100,000. In this example, 100,000 is the notional amount, sorry, 100,000 times the swap price is the notional amount of swap. Although the swap price is close to the mean of forward price, 82.5, it is not exactly the same. We said 82.28. Why? Suppose swap price is 82.5. Then the oil buyer would then be committing to pay 7.5 more than the forward price. Forward price was 75, and would pay 7.5 less than the forward price in the second year. Thus, the relative to the forward curve, the buyer would have made an interest-free loan to counterparty. To prevent that one, here is the swap price is 82.28. Then we are overpaying 7.28 in the first year and underpaying 7.72 in the second year, relative to forward curve. Basically, swap is equivalent to being long the two forward contract, coupled with an agreement to lend 7.28 to the counterparty in the first year and receive 772 in 2 years. The interest rate on this loan is 6%. Where does 6% come from? That is the 1-year implied forward yield from year 1 to 2. Basically, you are kind of making, giving swap counterparty 7.28 on top, swap counterparty returning you some kind of interest payments. Here, our swap counterparty is a dealer who hedge the oil price risk resulting from swap. However, they have to manage, the risk of the commodity exposure. In the early developments of swap markets, investment banks often served in a brokering capacity to bring together parties with opposite hedging needs. The currency swap between the World Bank and IBM, for example, was brokered by Salomon Brothers. While brokering swap eliminates the market price and credit risk to broker, the process of matching and negotiating swaps between counterparties with opposite hedging needs could be difficult. As a result, swap brokers who took on no market risk evolved into swap dealers who took the contract onto their books. When a swap dealer takes a swap onto its book, it takes on any price risk associated with the swap and thus must manage the risk of the commodity exposure. In addition, the counterparty bears a credit risk that the swap dealer may not honor its commitments. This risk can be significant in the case of a swap dealer because it is potentially entering into numerous transactions involving many counterparties, each of which exposes the swap dealer to additional credit risk. As a result of this risk, there has been natural tendency for financial institutions like commercial banks, investment banks, or insurance companies to become swap dealers. For example, one of the biggest swap dealers in crude oil market is Goldman Sachs. When a commercial entity uses a swap to offset its risk, the swap dealer assumes the price risk of the commodity. For example, if the swap dealer enters into a jet fuel swap with an airline, the airline agrees to periodically pay a fixed amount on the swap, while the swap dealer pays a floating amount based on the cash market price. At each point in time, when the payments are due and netting of the obligation takes place, and the party responsible for the larger payments pays the difference to the other party. Thus, if prices rise, the floating payment will be larger than the fixed price, and the swap dealer pays the net amount to the airline. Conversely, if prices fall, the airline will be required to make a payment to the swap dealer. Recall that when the airline makes a payment on the swap to the swap dealer, it means that at the same time, it is paying a lower price to acquire jet fuel in the cash market. The swap dealer, however, has no natural offsetting transaction to counterbalance this risk. That's why swap dealer will, in turn, hedge this price risk in the regulated futures market. Let's look at second type of swap arrangement or swap agreement. This is the most common in terms of notional value. It is the biggest markets. As I said, it is when I look at yesterday, it was $350 trillion markets. First swap is basically, let's look at plain vanilla interest rate swap. In this case, party B agrees to pay cash flows equal to the interest at a predetermined fixed rate on a notional principle for a number of years. Party A, on the other hand, agrees to pay party B cash flows equal to floating rate, in this case LIBOR it is variable, it changes every day, on the same notional principle for the same periods of time. The life of the swap can usually range from 2 years to over 15 years. For example, let's think about a 3-year swap initiated on March 1st, 2000. Company B agrees to pay to Company A at a rate of 5% per annum on a national principle of $100 million. And then Company A agrees to pay to Company B the 6-month LIBOR rate on the same notional principle. One is paying fixed rate, the other getting the other is paying LIBOR rate. LIBOR rate is it changes daily. The notional principle of the swap is 100 million. The life of the swap is called swap term or swap tenor. Borrowing rates is known at the beginning of the year. Here, the interest payment on the loan is due at the end of each year. Only net swap payments are actually made between swap counterparties. If one party defaults, they owe to the other party at most the present value of net swap payments. This implies swaps generally have less credit risk than bonds. Let's look this in a more concrete example of agreements between Microsoft and Intel. In this example, we are going to assume Microsoft receives 6 months LIBOR from Intel and then pays a fixed rate of 5% per annum, which is quoted also semi-annual compounding to Intel every 6 months for 3 years on a notional principle of $100 million. Intel pays here fixed rate of 5% per annum to Microsoft and receive 6 months LIBOR from Microsoft every 6 months for 3 years on a notional principle of 100 million. Here is the Microsoft is the fixed rate payer, Intel is the floating rate payer. What's happening here, the first exchange of payments would take place September 5th because the contract initiated March 5th. Sorry, I said March 1st, but March 5th here. 6 months after the initiation of the agreement, Microsoft would pay Intel 2.5 million. This is the interest on the 100 million principal for 6 months at 5%. Intel would pay Microsoft, on the other hand, interest on the 100 million principal at the 6-month LIBOR rate prevailing 6 months prior to September 5th. Let's assume that rate is 4.2%. That is known on March 5th, 4.2%. That is the yearly rate. Basically, to get the 6 months payment, you divide by 2, and then, of course, you get 2.1. Intel pays Microsoft 2.1 million. Note that there is no uncertainty about the LIBOR rate which are applied to September 5th because you know the LIBOR rate on March 5th. So for the first payment, for both parties, September 5th payment, both parties knows how much they are going to pay. Of course, Microsoft is a fixed rate payer, which is 5%. The other one is also interest rate is known, 4.2. Here, actually, what's happening is that one side remits, but they don't pay 2.5 and then 2.1. There is going to be a net cash flow of 0.4 million. On September 5th, basically, Microsoft pays 0.4 million to Intel. Actually, this amount was known at the time of the swap begins. However, after that, Microsoft knows how much is going to pay to Intel since it is the fixed rate payer. The amount of payment it is going to receive from Intel after the first payment is not known, because you don't know the LIBOR rates. It will all depend on the LIBOR rate prevailing 6 months prior to the payment date. In our example, second installment date is March 5th, 2021. Let us assume that on September 5th, 2020, the LIBOR rate is about 4.8. In this case, Intel pays 2.4 million to Microsoft. But actually what's happening, because it receives also 2.5 from Microsoft, the difference between these two payments is 0.1 million, which Microsoft again pays to Intel on March 5th, 2021. There are a total of 6 payments. Each calls for net payments of interest rate differential between the fixed rates and the LIBOR rate, multiplied by notional value. If LIBOR rate is greater than fixed rates, then the floating rate payer remits the difference to the fixed rate payer. If fixed rate is greater than the LIBOR rate, then the fixed rate payer remits the difference to floating rate payer. Here, the principal amount is not exchanged, just used for interest calculation. That is why it is called notional amount and notional principal. You should be careful when you hear $300 trillion interest rate swaps. I said $350 trillion. We are talking about the notional principal. This amount generally is not exchanged between parties, so it doesn't represent any credit risk. However, payment based on this principle always carries counterparty risk if it is not cleared by exchange or central clearinghouse. As you can see here, swap can be considered as the exchange of a fixed rate bond for a floating rate bond here. Microsoft is in a long a floating rate bonds and short a fixed rate bonds. Intel, on the other hand, is long a fixed rate bond and a short floating rate. Why the floating rate is set 6 months before it's paid? On a floating rate bond, interest is generally set at the beginning of the period to which it will apply and is paid at the end of the period. Here, basically what Microsoft and Intel did actually, they transformed their liability. For Microsoft, the swap could be used to transform a floating rate loan into fixed rate loan. Suppose that Microsoft borrowed 100 million at LIBOR plus 80 basis points. After Microsoft has entered into swap, it has 3 sets of cash flows here. One, it pays LIBOR plus 80 basis points to the outside lender. Then it enters into a swap agreement with Intel. It receives LIBOR from the Intel, and then it pays 5% to Intel. Net effect from the payment is the fixed rate payment of 5.8%. Basically, Microsoft started with LIBOR plus 0.8 for the outside lender, but at the end of the game, they have a fixed interest rate payments of 5.8. Microsoft transformed its liability from floating rate to fixed rate. For Intel, the swap could have the effect of transforming a fixed rate loan into a floating rate loan. Suppose that Intel has a 100 million loan on which it pays 5.2%. After Intel has entered into the swap, it has 3 sets of cash flows. It pays 5.2% to the outside lender. That's the fixed rate started. And then it pays LIBOR rate to Microsoft, and it receives 5%. Net effect, floating rate, interest rate payments of LIBOR plus 20 basis points. Basically, these three sets of all this net out to interest rate payments of 5.8% for Microsoft and LIBOR plus 20 basis points for Intel. For Microsoft, the swap could have the effect of transforming borrowing at a floating rate of LIBOR plus 0.8 or 80 basis points into borrowings at a fixed rate of 5.8%. On the other hand, for Intel, these three sets of cash payments net out to interest rate payments of LIBOR plus 20 basis points. For Intel, the swap could have the effect of transforming borrowings at a fixed rate of 5.2% into borrowing at a floating rate of LIBOR plus 20 basis points. This is, but similarly, let's suppose that instead of liability, let's suppose that think about the assets. Swap can also be used to transform the nature of an asset. For Microsoft, the swap could have the effect of transforming an asset earning a fixed rate of interest into an asset earning a floating rate. Suppose that Microsoft owns 100 million in bonds that will return 4.7% over the next 3 years. After Microsoft has entered into swaps, it has the following three sets of cash flows. It receives 4.7% on the bonds. It receives LIBOR under the terms of swaps, and it pays 5% under the terms of swaps. These three sets of cash flow net out the interest rate inflows of LIBOR minus 30 basis points. Microsoft transformed an asset earning 4.7% fixed rate into an asset earning LIBOR minus 30 basis points by entering into a swap. For Intel, opposite, basically, it receives LIBOR minus 0.25 basis points on the bonds from the external. It pays LIBOR under the swap term. It receives 5% under the terms of swaps. And then these three sets of cash flows net out to interest payments of inflows of 4.75%. Intel transformed an asset earning LIBOR minus 25 basis points into a floating rate, into an asset earning 4.75% fixed rate asset by entering into a swap. But generally, Intel and Microsoft do not trade or go into a swap agreement. They generally go through a financial institution. Generally, as I said, two financial companies do not get in touch with each other directly. They deal with a financial intermediary. Basically, here, the financial institution enters into two offsetting swap transactions with Intel and Microsoft. For Microsoft, the swap could be used to transform a floating rate loan into a fixed rate loan. Suppose that Microsoft borrowed 100 million at LIBOR plus 80 basis points. After Microsoft has entered into swap with the financial intermediary, it has three sets of cash flows in this example. It pays LIBOR plus 80 basis points to the outside lender. It receives LIBOR from the financial institution, and it pays 5.015% to financial institution. Net effect of these three different payments are 5.815%. Microsoft ends up borrowing 5.815 instead of 5.8%. For Intel, the swap could have the effect of transforming a fixed rate loan into a floating rate. Basically, their net effective rates, after all this, LIBOR plus 21.5 basis points. In each case, financial institution has two separate contracts. Also, here, plain vanilla swaps are structured so that financial institution earns about 3 or 4 basis points. That is the amount they are getting in order to take the risk. If basically both parties honor their obligation, financial institution gets 3 basis points here in this example per year, multiplied by the notional amount of 100 million, meaning $30,000 per year for the 3-year period. That is the payment for taking the risk. Let's look at finally foreign exchange swaps, currency swaps. Firms sometimes issue debt denominated in a foreign currency. Most of the time, they use forward contract to hedge exchange rates risk. But they might use also currency swap, in which payments are based on the difference between in that payments denominated in different currencies. One popular type of currency swap is known as fixed for fixed currency swap. Basically, in this case, you are exchanging principal and interest payment at a fixed rate in one currency for principal and interest rate payments at a fixed rate in another currency. A currency swap agreement requires the principals to be specified in each of the two currencies. The principal amounts are usually exchanged at the beginning and at the end of the life of the swap, as opposed to interest rate, because you don't exchange the principal. Usually principal amount chosen so that they are equal when expressed in the same currency at the exchange rate at the swap's initiation date. As I said, in an interest rate swap, the principal is not exchanged, but in a currency swap, the principal is usually exchanged at the beginning and end of the swap life. Sorry. Let's look at an example here. In our hypothetical example, swap agreement between IBM and British Petroleum, BP, they entered into a swap contract, currency swap contract on March 5th, 2000. We suppose that IBM pays a fixed rate of interest rate of 2% in sterling and receives a fixed rate of 3% in dollars from British Petroleum. Interest rate payments are made once a year, and the principal amount is are $15 million and 10 million pounds. This is termed fixed for fixed currency swap because the interest rate in each currency is at a fixed rate. Here, what's happening, IBM lends its $15 million to British Petroleum, gets 3% interest annually for the next 5 years. In return, BP lends its 10 million pounds to IBM and gets 2% interest annually for the next 5 years. On the contract sign date or swap initiation date, which is March 5th, 2015, in our example, the principals are exchanged, but no interest payments until next year. For the following 4 years, each party remits only interest payments. For example, IBM receives $450,000 from BP and pays 200,000 pounds to BP. At the end of swap life, both parties pays the last interest payment as well as the returns, as well as to return the principals to the lender. Here is the case. In 2015, March 5, 2015, basically, this is the cash flows to IBM. IBM lends its $15 million to BP. In return, they got 10 million pounds in 2015. There is no interest payment. But first year, 2016, interest payment is exchange. Up until the last year, 2020, on that year, both last interest payment as well as principal exchange again. Of course, you can use currency swaps like interest rate swaps to convert from a liability in one currency to a liability in another currency, or to convert from an investment in one currency to an investment in another currency. This is very similar to interest rate swaps. There are other swap type. For example, if you look at interest rate swap, there are deferred swap or so-called forward swaps. If the swap begins at some date in future, but for which the swap rate is agreed upon today. Or we have the constant maturity swap. This is an exchange, a LIBOR rate for a swap rates. Or constant maturity treasury swap. This is an exchange, a LIBOR rate for a particular treasury rate. Or we can have a compounding swap. In a currency swap, they might be fixed for fixed, as you see, that is the interest rate was fixed, or we can have fixed for floating currency swaps, also known as cross-currency interest rate swaps, currency coupon swap or circle swap. Or we can have floating for floating currency swap. Or the last one is the diff swap, so-called quanto, short for differential swap. Payments are made based on the difference in floating interest rate in two different currencies with the notional amount in single currency. Of course, we can have not only currency or interest rate, we can have equity swaps or swaption actually. That's very popular lately. An option to enter into a swap is called a swaption. One party with the right at a future time to enter into a swap where a predetermined fixed rate is exchanged for floating rate. So the question is, okay, all this, but why do we need swaps? There are some arguments. The most popular argument is the comparative advantage. Some companies might have a comparative advantage in borrowing in the fixed rate market, while other companies have a comparative advantage in the floating rate market. As we saw in the World Bank IBM, IBM has a very difficult time or very high interests, faced very high interest in borrowing dollar. That's why it went into a swap agreement with World Bank, which has comparative advantage in borrowing US dollar in a much lower interest rate. When obtaining a new loan, it is convenient for a company to go to market where it has a comparative advantage. This may lead to company borrowing fixed when it wants floating and vice versa. Swap is used to transform the fixed rate loan into a floating rate loan or vice versa, of course. Likewise, currency swaps can be motivated by comparative advantage. So finally, of course, there are many advantages of swaps. They are widely used, interest rates, Forex or commodities. As I said, the current notional amount of swaps over-the-counter derivatives, $550 trillion, of which about $400 to $450 trillion are swaps. The remaining, it might be options or forwards. They are very customizable, and swap dealers can customize or can tailor according to customer or client's needs, they can be used for hedging and speculation purposes, or to transform a liability or transform an asset from fixed rate to floating rates. There are disadvantages, of course. There is the lack of liquidity. There is no secondary markets, and then so there is a credit risk, because it was not clear at all. It was agreement between two parties, so you are open to credit counterparty risk, and they are not as transparent as exchange traded instruments. And of course, all these disadvantages, we saw a very big crisis in 2007-2008 periods. They're very big implication for swap or the over-the-counter markets. After the crisis, there are lots of attempts to fix or to regulate these markets. Especially, we try to bring standardization of OTC derivatives contracts, which should start trading on the exchanges or electronic trading platform. Or we brought some clearing requirements for standardized swaps through an intermediary company with sufficient capital, such as clearing houses or central counterparties. And they brought some reporting requirements. Before, we didn't have anything. Now, whatever the swaps agreed, they had to be reported to swap data repositories. And standardized swaps, especially, they have to be exchanged in swap execution facilities. But the question is how this new regulation will help. For example, just think about central clearing requirements. Of course, clearing requirements for standardized swaps through an intermediary company with sufficient capital, such as clearinghouse or central counterparties, a measure introduced to eliminate counterparty risk, right, have also become a target of criticism here. Proponents of the requirements argue that central clearing has worked in futures market for over a century. Critics counter that the present regulatory reform and regulation may not remove systemic risk from OTC derivatives, but rather shift it from counterparties to central clearing parties. For example, one study done by IMF concluded that the central clearing system, far more reducing systemic risk, actually it is increases. As a result, basically, we have Commodity Futures Trading Commission has issued many rulemaking between 2010 and up until now, actually, that's called extension of Dodd-Frank Act to regulate these markets. We still see what's called the implication or impacts of this regulation in terms of liquidity, in terms of counterparty risk, and all this stuff. Basically, what we have seen, the futurization of swaps, basically, is if you are standardizing the swaps, you are becoming a futures market. Then one of the best unique benefit of swaps are gone. Basically, it is the customization or customer needs. Anyway, I'm going to stop here for this week. Next week, I will talk options markets, especially call and put options and moneyness of options, and we will complete our lecture on using how to use options to hedge in especially commodity markets. Thank you so much. Gökberk, this is done.